Hi, have you ever wondered how facial reconstructions are made? I'm Dr. Catyana Skory Falsetti, and before I was an urban planner and sociologist, I worked as a forensic artist for over a decade. I'm here to answer that question and also consider how racial categories may influence the outcome of finding missing and unidentified people. Did you know that there's an estimated over 40,000 people that are unidentified in this country? It's called by some the nation's silent mass disaster. All of these unidentified decedents, which are basically bodies in morgues or medical examiners' offices that are left behind that are unidentified. So the people that work in these places don't know where to send them, and the people that cared about these individuals don't have any answers of what happened to them. As I mentioned, I was a forensic artist for over a decade, and I'll touch on what forensic art is. It's any image that's used in a courtroom that can include composite sketches, facial reconstructions, courtroom exhibits, or age progression. It's a combination of art and science, and it's the point of creating an image is to stimulate the public's memory, to really get that image out there in front of the public, and then connect it with individuals who can then provide information for a positive identification, because forensic art itself is not a positive form of identification. So facial reconstructions have been done for centuries, largely for historic cases and out of curiosity. But in the 1800s, anatomists really looked at facial reconstructions more scientifically and were able to rebuild some faces. And you can see those images here. There's also a tissue depth and anatomical method, which was developed by a Russian anatomist in the 1930s and is written about at length in this book by Dr. Carolyn Wilkinson called Forensic Facial Reconstruction, and I'll link that in the description, where it uses the musculature along with tissue depths measurements to rebuild faces. In the United States, the first forensic facial reconstruction was done in 1967 by a medical illustrator called Betty Pat Gatliff, and she worked with an anthropologist named Dr. Clyde Snow, and they had an unidentified skull, and Dr. Snow asked her to make a facial reconstruction. You can see that in the top left corner. She did a facial reconstruction. She did actually half the face, and then you can tell by the kind of line in the middle, then they just used a mirror to make it look like it's the whole face. And that's what the individual ended up looking like. And the picture on the bottom left is of me with Betty Pat during my FBI training in forensic art. I had the pleasure of meeting her, and I had the honor to get training from Karen Taylor, who's pictured here on the far right, and whose book I've taken some of these images from, Forensic Art and Illustration. And I also got the pleasure of meeting Horace Hefner, who was the father of forensic art at the FBI, so it was great. In 2005, I had that training. When I started in 2002, after my degree and much studies, I was asked to do a facial reconstruction of an unidentified person who was found in Virginia when I worked at the medical examiner's office, and had that opportunity, and the image was published, and within 30 hours of publication, it was wonderful to have given the family some answers. The family came forward, identified this individual, and was able to provide information to make sure it was him. But that was amazing, right? So within 30 hours, which at the time I didn't know how unusual that was. It's oftentimes cases go on for months, years, or never get identified. I've had cases where, decades later I'll find out that that individual was, an individual that I worked on was identified, but sometimes it takes a long time or doesn't happen. Another case that I helped with was a case from 1975, and in 2012 I was asked to do a facial reconstruction, which I did on the left hand side in clay, and the image was put out, and the family came forward and identified this individual. He was positively identified through DNA, and it was an amazing outcome. And I had the honor and the pleasure of meeting the family with the death investigator and the anthropologist at a conference. If you want to learn more about forensic facial reconstruction, I've written murder mystery novels that were inspired by my work. The first one is called Facing Death, and the second one is called Saving Face. I'll put the links to the books in the video description. I hope you'll check them out. So what are these tissue depth measurements that I keep talking about? So these are anatomical points that were designated by anatomists that I mentioned, and here pictured is Dr. Stan Rhine. Here's a tissue depth chart and one of his papers where he really looked at tissue depth points around the face, 21 points. And historically, they would get these points from cadavers, right? So they would take a needle and then put it into different parts of the face and then measure how far it went into. So that's literally the tissue, the depth of the tissues. So now researchers are using more advanced methods to get tissue depth measurements, whether that be ultrasound or MRIs or CT scans. There are consistently studies around the world of different tissue depth averages for different populations. So in addition to these tissue depth measurement charts, we would work with detectives to get scene data. So it's photographs, clothing, and it's really important to have the size of the clothing because the person isn't going to be in clothes that are too tight for them generally, so they're around that size. They might be smaller. And also the hair, because we can't tell hair from a skull alone, although there's new technology that can. But that technology is not always available to law enforcement due to cost. There's a variety of quality of facial reconstructions. It's the bottom on the left, and there's some other from artists in Georgia and Karen Taylor, and the computerized is from, I believe it's from an artist in Brazil. Forensic artists work with biological anthropologists who have years of study, and generally a PhD in the topic, to really be able to identify biological differences. They can determine biological sex through the skull and the pelvis, ancestry, at least in 3 general categories of European, African, and Asian ancestry. But the issue of mixed ancestry and the construct of race within communities is not discernible through biological means. So now there is a company called Parabon, which can make facial reconstructions, and they use DNA to also be able to tell the skin color of an individual, the eye color, the hair color, which is great. There's a forensic artist who works there in conjunction with the DNA analysts who can provide more information. And it's a great resource, but often it's more expensive than a lot of police departments can invest in. And what happens to all this information? So there is a website called NameUs.gov that is a federally supported website that is a location for law enforcement to put in information about missing persons, and medical examiners' offices and coroners to put information about unidentified decedents, and also the public can search it. And as you can see here, the race ethnicities are categories the same as census, right? Because when law enforcement documentation, medical examiners documentation all uses the census designated categories. So what does that mean for mixed race individuals? Well, it means that there may be issues of identification if a person's biological category is determined by an investigator, an anthropologist, or a doctor as one group, but if the family identifies as different, or the police identify it as a different category, there is going to be a mismatch, and that match might not happen. For example, in a lot of places there are people who might come from a South American or Caribbean location who would identify as Hispanic, but they biologically would present as European or white. So a lot of people of Spanish descent, or they might present as Asian if they're, Chinese descent or Japanese descent, right, depending, or, African American if they're of African descent. So that is one of the bigger mismatches that could happen. I've long wondered, what category I would be put into. And I asked my husband, who's a forensic anthropologist, who will be on the show soon to talk about his experiences. And the field is changing now. There's a lot of discussion around how to address these issues of mixed race and race as a social construct, and how it really informs kind of the field and forensics. I looked for research on mixed race individuals and was able to find a few articles. The older one be on the right from 1996 about computerized CT scans for tissue depth thickness in mixed race population, which is useful, but if unidentified remains aren't identified as mixed race, how would an artist know to use these? A master's student talked about mixed race ancestry from Louisiana State University, and he discussed the issues around, the mixed raceness in Louisiana, in particular between whites and Native Americans and African Americans. And most recently, there was an article from Indonesia that was colonized by the Dutch, and looking at the tissue depths and the facial approximations around somebody who was Eurasian. So, there is kind of that discussion around how to deal with this, but ultimately this has not moved into kind of systems and procedures. So what do you think about this topic? Have you ever considered how you're perceived or your biological features might be described would impact these forensic issues? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any questions, I'd love to know what you're curious about this topic so I can look into it. And I'll be having more people from the forensic field to discuss their experiences with identification, I guess. Okay. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.